I still remember the sound before I remember the sight. It was that sharp, repetitive whine of an impact driver echoing through my backyard on a quiet Saturday morning, the kind of sound that makes you glance out the kitchen window without really expecting to find anything unusual. 10 minutes later, I was standing on my patio with a coffee in one hand, staring at two construction workers fastening a wooden deck directly into the exterior wall of my house. My wall? And my neighbor was smiling like he had every right in the world to do it. Looking back now, that moment could have turned into one of those ugly neighborhood screaming matches you see online every day, but instead it became something much more satisfying, because sometimes the most devastating thing you can do isn't raise your voice. It's simply let the rules do the talking. My name is Ethan Brooks, and I have lived on Willow Creek Lane just outside Franklin, Tennessee, for almost 17 years. Long enough to watch kids grow up and leave for college, long enough to replace my roof twice, long enough for every crack in the sidewalk to feel familiar. My wife, Claire, always joked that I knew more about this property than I knew about myself. She wasn't entirely wrong. I had every survey, every permit, every receipt tucked neatly into labeled folders inside a filing cabinet in my home office. My father spent 30 years working as a building inspector, and one lesson he repeated my entire childhood was simple. Good fences make good neighbors, but good paperwork keeps lawyers away. That lesson stuck with me. The east wall of my house wasn't just another wall. It marked the legal boundary of my property, reinforced by a survey completed years earlier after we installed new drainage. I knew exactly where every inch of my lot began and ended, not because I was obsessive, but because owning a home teaches you that certainty is cheaper than fixing someone else's mistake later. 4 years before everything happened, a man named Ryan Mercer bought the house next door. At first, he seemed perfectly normal, friendly enough to wave when we grabbed the mail. We'd chat about football once in a while, complain about rising property taxes, even lend each other a ladder now and then. We were never close friends, but we respected each other's space, and honestly, that's about all I asked from a neighbor. Things started changing the spring he decided his backyard needed a makeover. One week, there were delivery trucks dropping off lumber. The next week, a trailer full of concrete bags showed up. Then came the contractors. Every morning around 7, I could hear nail guns popping while I drank coffee before work. None of that bothered me. People renovate houses all the time. I figured I'd eventually look over the fence and see a nice new deck or patio. Instead, what I saw made me stop walking. 2 workers were holding a long pressure-treated ledger board against the side of my house, while another guy drilled pilot holes straight through my exterior wall. At first, my brain refused to process what I was looking at. I actually convinced myself I had to be seeing it from the wrong angle. I walked closer. No, there was no mistake. The framing wasn't beside my wall. It wasn't near my wall. It was attached to my wall. Ryan noticed me standing there and gave me a casual wave like nothing unusual was happening. "Morning, Ethan," he called out. "Deck's finally going in." I looked from him to the workers. "Why are they drilling into my house?" He laughed. Actually laughed. "It's just the support board. Save space. Contractor says everybody does it." I waited a second, thinking maybe he'd realize how ridiculous that sounded. He didn't. "Did you ask me?" I said. "Ask you what?" "For permission to bolt your deck into my wall." He shrugged so casually it almost impressed me. "Come on, man. It's just a deck. It's not hurting anything." That answer told me everything I needed to know. It wasn't that he thought he was right. It was that he'd already decided my opinion didn't matter. I looked toward one of the contractors, hoping maybe he'd speak up, but both of them suddenly found the lumber pile incredibly interesting. They knew exactly what conversation they wanted no part of. I took one slow breath and said, "Did you pull a building permit?" Ryan rolled his eyes. "You're really going to be that neighbor? I'm asking a simple question. It's private property. Half of what you're building isn't." His smile faded for just a second before returning. "Relax. It'll be finished by Monday." That was the moment I realized arguing would accomplish absolutely nothing. People like Ryan always mistake patience for weakness, and they usually confuse silence with surrender. I simply nodded, turned around, walked back into my house, set my untouched coffee on the counter, and opened my laptop. Less than 15 minutes later, I had the county property records open on one screen, the building permit database on another, and my own survey from 5 years earlier spread across the desk. My stomach wasn't full of anger anymore. It was something colder than that. Certainty. By lunchtime, I had found exactly what I expected. There wasn't a single permit issued for Ryan's address. Not for a deck. Not for structural work. Nothing. I submitted an online request for a code compliance inspection. Attached photos I had taken that morning, referenced the property line survey, and hit send. Then I closed my laptop, went outside, and waved politely at Ryan as he admired the frame of what he clearly believed would become the centerpiece of his backyard. He waved right back, completely unaware that the countdown on his brand new deck had already begun. Reply with part 2 and I'll continue the story seamlessly. The following Thursday started like any other workday. I was answering emails in my home office when I noticed a white county pickup easing its way down Willow Creek Lane. It wasn't moving fast, just slowly enough to make people peek through their blinds. The truck stopped in front of Ryan's house, and a man in a navy polo stepped out carrying a clipboard, a laser measuring tool, and a camera. I remember smiling to myself, not because I wanted Ryan to get into trouble, but because I knew something important was about to happen. Rules don't care who likes you, who has the bigger truck, or who talks the loudest. They just sit there quietly until someone ignores them. Ryan came walking out of his garage wearing sunglasses and holding a travel mug, looking completely relaxed. He actually greeted the inspector with the confidence of someone expecting a 5-minute conversation and a handshake. I stayed inside. My blinds were open, but I had no interest in standing outside like some nosy neighbor waiting for the show. Claire walked into the office, looked out the window, then looked at me. "County?" she asked. I nodded. "You called?" "I filed an inspection request," she smiled. "Good." That was one thing I always appreciated about my wife. She never encouraged unnecessary conflict, but she also believed people should deal with the consequences of their own decisions. We watched quietly as the inspector introduced himself to Ryan. At first, the conversation seemed friendly enough. Ryan pointed proudly toward the deck framing, explaining how it would overlook the backyard. The inspector nodded politely, wrote a few notes, then asked one question I couldn't hear. Ryan pointed toward the house, shrugged, and answered. A minute later, the inspector looked up toward the ledger board attached to my wall, and everything changed. His posture shifted. He walked closer. He ran his hand along the fasteners, took several photographs, then stepped back and pulled out his laser measure. After measuring the distance between the deck and the property line, he looked toward my house again before writing another page of notes. Ryan's smile had disappeared. 15 minutes later, the inspector knocked on my front door. When I opened it, he introduced himself. "Mr. Brooks? That's me. Would you mind answering a couple questions?" "Of course." He asked whether I had granted written permission for the deck attachment. "No." Whether there was a recorded easement allowing structural access. "No." Whether the wall belonged exclusively to my property according to my survey. I handed him the folder I had already prepared. He flipped through the documents carefully, comparing the survey with county records on his tablet. "Thank you," he said. "This helps." His professionalism impressed me. He wasn't looking for someone to blame. He was simply verifying facts. That's what good inspectors do. They don't care about personalities. They care about compliance. From my porch, I watched him return next door. This time, the conversation looked much less friendly. Ryan started gesturing with both hands. The inspector remained calm, occasionally pointing toward the wall, then toward the property stakes, then writing more notes. One of the contractors quietly gathered his tools and walked back toward his truck. That's usually a pretty good sign things aren't going according to plan. Around 20 minutes later, the inspector pulled a bright orange notice from his folder and taped it directly onto one of the deck posts. Even from across the property line, I knew exactly what it was. A stop work order. Construction stopped immediately. Nail guns went silent. Fressers shut off. The backyard that had been full of noise all week suddenly felt strangely peaceful. Ryan stood there staring at the paper like it was written in another language. The inspector wasn't finished. Before leaving, he walked the entire perimeter of the structure one more time, taking additional photographs of every place where the ledger board penetrated my exterior wall. Later that afternoon, I received an email summarizing the preliminary findings. The deck had been built without a permit. The required setback from the property line had been violated. Structural connections had been made to an adjacent residence without authorization. Most importantly, the attachment compromised a fire separation wall that required specific engineering approval and fire-rated sealing methods. That wasn't just a paperwork issue anymore. It was considered a safety hazard. About an hour after the inspector left, my phone rang. "Ryan." I let it ring twice before answering. "Hey," I said calmly. He skipped every greeting. "Why the hell did you call the county?" His voice was tight, controlled, but I could hear panic underneath. Because someone attached a structure to my house. You could have talked to me first. I actually laughed. Not because it was funny, but because the irony hit me all at once. Ryan, I did. Silence. Saturday morning, I continued. Remember? I asked if you had permission. You said, it's just a deck. He didn't answer. Then I asked if you had a permit. More silence. You dismissed me in less than 30 seconds. Finally he spoke. You didn't have to make this official. You already made it official when your contractor drilled into my wall. He exhaled hard. Now they're saying I need an engineer. Sounds expensive. They're saying I might have to tear the whole thing down. That's between you and the county. He muttered something under his breath before hanging up. Over the next week, the neighborhood transformed into its own little rumor mill. Mrs. Henderson from 3 houses down claimed she'd heard the county was fining Ryan thousands of dollars. Another neighbor insisted the contractor had lost his license. Neither rumor turned out to be true. But one thing was obvious. Everyone had noticed the orange notice taped to the unfinished deck. Nobody asked me directly what happened, but I caught plenty of curious glances whenever I checked the mail. Claire handled it better than I did. Whenever someone hinted at the situation, she'd simply smile and say, "It's being handled." That was enough. About 2 weeks later, I saw Ryan meeting with another contractor and what looked like a structural engineer. They spent nearly 2 hours measuring everything before leaving. The next day, a dumpster arrived. I figured demolition had been approved, but instead they tried another option first. Ryan submitted revised plans proposing to rebuild the deck farther inside his property while keeping part of the original framing. Unfortunately for him, the county rejected those plans because the original attachment had already compromised the wall, and the setback still didn't meet code without a complete redesign. A few days after that, I accidentally overheard Ryan arguing with someone in his driveway. I wasn't trying to eavesdrop. I was trimming hedges near the property line when his contractor raised his voice. "I told you from day one we needed permits." Ryan shot back. "You told me it'd cost more, because doing it legally always costs more than doing it twice." That sentence stuck with me. Doing it legally always costs more than doing it twice. Except sometimes doing it twice costs far more. Word eventually got around that rebuilding everything correctly would cost somewhere around $12,000 once engineering reviews, permit fees, demolition, inspections, and new materials were included. Ryan had already spent thousands building the original deck. Now he'd have to pay just to erase it before paying again to build another one. For several evenings, I'd see him sitting alone on his patio looking at the unfinished structure. He looked exhausted, older somehow. Part of me actually felt sorry for him. Nobody enjoys watching another person lose that much money, but sympathy has limits, especially when the entire disaster began with a decision that could have been avoided by a 2-minute conversation across the fence. The county eventually issued its final notice. Ryan had 45 days to remove every unauthorized structural connection, restore the integrity of my exterior wall under county supervision, and either submit completely new code-compliant plans or abandon the project altogether. There were no more extensions, no more negotiations, and no clever shortcuts left. As July rolled around, the clock kept ticking, and every time I looked out my kitchen window, that unfinished deck looked a little less like someone's dream backyard and a little more like a countdown waiting to reach zero. Saturday morning finally arrived with clear skies and the kind of summer heat that settles in before breakfast. I stepped onto my back patio with a fresh cup of coffee, expecting another quiet weekend. And there was Ryan, standing alone in the middle of his backyard with a pry bar in one hand and a cordless drill in the other. No contractors, no crew, no delivery trucks. Just one man getting ready to take apart the biggest and most expensive mistake he'd ever made. For a minute, neither of us said anything. The first board came off with a loud crack, followed by the slow squeal of screws backing out of lumber that had barely been in place for 2 months. It was strange watching the whole thing happen in reverse. Building the deck had looked exciting. Taking it apart looked exhausting. Every few minutes, Ryan would stop, wipe sweat from his forehead, stare at what was left, then start again. Around lunchtime, he noticed me sitting on my patio. Our eyes met for a second. I gave him a small nod. Not a smirk, not a victory wave, just a nod. He looked away and kept working. Somewhere during that afternoon, I realized I wasn't enjoying his misery nearly as much as I thought I would. What I felt instead was relief. Relief that my wall hadn't been permanently damaged. Relief that nobody had been hurt because of shortcuts hidden behind finished lumber. Relief that this neighborhood wasn't going to spend the next 10 years fighting over a problem that should never have existed. Claire came outside with a sandwich and sat beside me. She watched Ryan work for a while before quietly asking, "Do you think he finally understands?" I thought about it before answering. "I think he's learning an expensive lesson." She smiled. "Those are usually the ones people remember." By Sunday evening, the deck was gone. Every joist, every beam, every railing had been stacked into neat piles beside a rented dumpster. The only thing left was a row of patched holes where the ledger board had once been fastened into my exterior wall. The following Tuesday, the county inspector returned for the final inspection. He examined the repairs carefully, checked the fire-rated sealant installed by a licensed contractor, reviewed photographs documenting the restoration, and spent a few minutes comparing everything against his earlier report. Finally, he closed his clipboard and said something I won't forget. "Mr. Brooks, your wall has been restored to compliance. We'll be closing the case." It wasn't dramatic. There were no applause, no courtroom speeches, no television cameras. Just one sentence from a professional doing his job. Sometimes that's exactly what justice looks like. A week later, I found Ryan walking toward my driveway while I was mowing the lawn. He looked uncomfortable, almost like he'd rehearsed what he wanted to say. "Got a minute?" he asked. I shut off the mower. "Sure." He stood there rubbing the back of his neck before finally speaking. I should have listened that first day. I nodded but didn't interrupt. "I thought you were just being difficult. I figured everybody bends the rules a little." "Some rules," I replied, "are written because somebody got hurt before the rest of us ever got here." He looked down at the ground. "Cost me almost 13 grand by the time everything was over. Probably would have cost a lot less to knock on my door." He actually laughed at that. The first genuine laugh I'd heard from him in months. "Yeah." Probably about 30 seconds and a handshake. We stood there for another minute talking about completely ordinary things. Football season, rising insurance premiums, how expensive lumber had become. It wasn't the beginning of some great friendship, but it was the end of a conflict that never should have existed in the first place. A few months later, Ryan hired a different contractor. This time permits were posted in plain sight before the first shovel touched the ground. The new deck sat entirely inside his property line, completely independent of my house. It looked great, honestly. One afternoon, he even waved me over to take a look. "No shared walls this time," he joked. "I noticed," I laughed back. Looking back now, people sometimes ask whether I regret calling the county instead of trying harder to work things out privately. My answer is always the same. I did try. Respect always starts with a conversation, but it can't end with one person deciding your property, your rights, and your voice don't matter. The inspection didn't destroy Ryan's deck. His own decisions did. Every shortcut, every assumption, every moment he chose convenience over responsibility led him exactly where he ended up. The county simply documented the truth, and maybe that's the biggest lesson this whole experience taught me. Boundaries aren't about keeping good people out. They're about reminding everyone where respect begins. Now I'm curious what you think. If your neighbor had attached part of their project directly to your home without asking, would you have handled it differently? Would you have given them another chance? Or would you have called the county just like I did? Let me know in the comments because I've seen people argue both sides of this for years, and I'm genuinely interested to hear where you stand. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share it with someone who's ever had a neighbor test their patience. You never know whose next backyard project might become the next unforgettable neighborhood story.